John, you want to say a little welcome? He's the editor for the OD Practitioner.
Thank you, Steve, for setting these up. It's really great to have authors from the OD Practitioner have a chance to interact with people other than just on the page of the OD Practitioner. And Don, I'm looking forward to your presentation. Having enjoyed the article, and when I included it in the Practitioner, found it to be a very helpful process for mindfully exploring contentious issues. So I'm looking forward to it.
Thanks very much, John.
And we have John Spalding out in Chatland and monitoring our conversations out there. John, how are you, and what are you curious about for today's session?
Thanks. I am doing good, and as far as being curious for today's session, I'm interested to see what some of our participants have to say about their reactions and reflections to Don's work on the tripod, and then I'm also interested to see your reaction to applying it to be a more mindful practitioner. And I'm interested about that. I'm also interested about that for myself.
Yeah, and for me too, I think I'll chime in with you on that. And I'm very interested in the notion of mindfulness. It's becoming a lot more important. And I'll have to tell you, Don, after we talked originally, and I've talked with a couple other people about mindfulness, I've been helping our Little League baseball players be a little bit more mindful in their play, particularly when they get stressed out. And
wow, that's great.
Yeah, so it's kind of neat, and it's been helpful to them. So I'm really looking forward to what you're going to share with us today. So we have Don. Here's handsome Don right here on the right. And Don, if you could, share with us a little bit about what your passion is for this topic and how you came to pursue this topic and why it's important for you to be able to share this with us today.
Well, thanks, Steve, and thanks, everyone. Look, I guess just on the mindfulness thing, I've been interested in mindfulness really my whole adult life. I'm a long-term meditator and just been kind of generally curious about that. I got into OD in the late 80s through postgraduate study and spent a lot of time thinking and later writing about leadership, and became interested in the question of getting away from sort of leadership as just the province of leaders to thinking about leadership action and what it would mean to enact leadership mindfully. And I was fortunate enough to meet up with Ellen Langer, the renowned Harvard professor, 2 or 3 years ago, and we got talking about leadership and mindfulness and wrote an article on that topic together. But in the OD space, I've noticed that a lot of OD writing tends to either focus on the past or focus on the future and possibilities, and that's reflected in a lot of the work on appreciative inquiry. But it seemed to me that in connection with mindfulness, there's kind of a big gap there. We've got this binary between, problems and what doesn't work and the future and what might be possible, but we don't seem to put much effort into thinking about the present and what's actually happening now and seeing that mindfully in all its richness and from different perspectives. And so that's a key kind of interest of mine. The idea of the tripod really sprang from my book on the leadership mode, which I wrote about 6 years ago, and I introduced what I called 3 key guidelines for leadership action, which were really the work from observation, attribute reasonableness, and act authentically. And so they eventually took shape in the image of the tripod. And so it's a long-term bunch of passions that's culminated in this work. It's as if all the work of my adult career has been distilled into kind of one image, the tripod. It's boiled down to a page. So there you go, Steve.
Yeah, that's nice, and definitely, the old adage of keep it simple, right? So boiling it down like you have makes it accessible to other people as well. So that's great that you've been able to do that. And could you share with us the agenda for today? You want to speak to what you're going to take us through, and then we'll turn the slides over to John, and he'll walk through them with you.
Okay. Now I'm going to have to be very present here because for some technology-related reason, I can't see what you're seeing on my screen. So I'm going to ask John Spalding to just tell me what slide is on the screen at any moment, and I'll chime into that. But essentially the outline is, I thought it'd be interesting just to check in with people in a very quick poll about people's need to have challenging conversations and whether they're tending to avoid those or kind of hold back from them. I thought then we'd look at a case story of applying the tripod. So I'll introduce a case very briefly, and we'll step through the legs of the tripod, and we'll think about how to apply the tripod in that particular case. We'll then touch briefly on a few points about using the tripod effectively, then maybe say a little about being mindful in this practice, and maybe even a word about practicing OD mindfully in a larger scale using the tripod with large groups. But I want to make it highly interactive, so I'll be guided by you, and we'll see what happens with the discussion. So let's take this as a light outline. We might sort of not go through every element of it. We might change direction, but let's be in the moment and take the opportunities that arise.
That's great. So let's turn over. Let's John, I'm going to give you the slides. John Spalding's going to run the slides today, or Don, and so I'm sending the slides over to you.
Okay. And then for those of you that have just entered, look under the chat feature on the GoToWebinar control panel and make sure to click on the tinyurl.com/SteveKatyWebinar. If you're not able to get into that chat room, just use the questions or the chat to send me messages, and I'll make sure they get into the room. I'm going to go ahead and share this now.
Right. Right.
Okay, so John, you'll just need to tell me what slide you're showing now.
Yep. We're just, Don, we're just waiting a second as John's, there you go. There we go. We need to go ahead and...
Don, we have the title slide, and we have our opening poll questions.
Okay, good. So we'll just, people can read those and we'll see what they come up with.
Okay.
And Steve, if you want to launch those, and these are just simple yes or no questions.
Yep.
And the first one, will you be having a challenging conversation sometime soon, whether at work or outside of work?
And I'd be curious if you could describe what that is, as much as you wish to share in the chat room for those of you that are there. What is that challenging conversation, or what makes that challenge? I'd be curious about that. So we've got 80% of people are having one, 20% don't have one, and I bet the 80% wish they could hand off their conversation to the 20%, or maybe not. And that's probably part of what you'll be talking with us about, Don. And so the next one is, have you repeatedly put off or avoided having this conversation? And waiting to see. So is this conversation that's coming up, one you've been putting off? And okay. Well, it looks like 83% said no, they're not putting it off, but 17% said that they were putting off the conversation.
Well, there you go. That's I must say that's a surprising result for me. I'd expected more people to be perhaps finding the going a bit tough and putting it off a bit. But that just shows what a tuned-in group we've got here. Probably all pretty skilled in this area. So good stuff.
Gerardo says that he's got a merger process and upper management level discussion and downward level discussion that he is having to facilitate or have.
Good. Thanks, Gerardo.
Okay, John, you want to take it on board?
Yep. And so next up, we just have the meet Susan.
Yeah, let's meet Susan. So Susan Parker is a manager in. She looks after a group of teams which deliver aged care health services in different geographic locations. Susan's come into the job with a brief and a need to achieve greater synergies across these various teams to get them sharing evidence and best practice and you know, learning from each other to improve performance and you know, build an integrated model that all the teams use. But what she's noticed is that they tend to run their own race. They have their own particular methods. They don't talk much to each other in meetings. She thinks that the problem is really that they're not putting enough into joint cross-team work on shared priorities, but she needs to have this conversation. And so if we go to the next slide, John, we'll just introduce the working from observation leg, and then we'll apply it in Susan's case.
Yep, and I'll do that. Steve, can you confirm that everyone's just seeing the slide and not the actual direction page?
They're basically seeing working from observation and slide to the right, observation, the next slide to the right.
Okay, well, we'll just pause on the working from observation slide for the moment. And it's really just to highlight why it is we emphasize this working from observation leg of the tripod. It goes to the idea that we tend to react rather than observe. We tend to come to snap analyses and assessments of what the problem is. So Susan says, well, you know, the problem is they're not putting in enough time on joint work. The point about observation is to step back, to just allow that there might be other possible interpretations. If we're working from observation, we can share our data, so we get more specific about that. She might say, in our meetings, I've noticed that we spend only 15% of the time talking about these common projects. To me, that seems like not enough. But the more we can have fine-grained observation-based data, we improve our ability to avoid getting locked into, you know, one interpretation and running down that track. We keep things open and we keep things testable. So if we could go to the next slide, John, which has the iceberg. And I just want to make the distinction there between observation and inference. So if you think of the iceberg image, we can only observe what's above the waterline of the iceberg. So when we're working with other people, we tend to make inferences and interpretations. We tend to go below the waterline. We make judgments about their motivations and their intentions. They're not directly visible, you know, they're inferences. So it's best to just think, what's actually above the surface of the iceberg? Now, there is an element of subjectivity here. If you can imagine we're on a boat in the Antarctic and we're all viewing an iceberg. It's a big boat. We're standing at different positions on the deck. Depending on where we're standing, we might see slightly different facets of the iceberg. So it's not about, observation is not just about the facts, not just about what's measurable. It's allowing, there's a bit of subjectivity, but we're trying to get more objective. You know, we're trying to at least focus on what can be seen rather than what's below the waterline. That's the subject of the next part of the tripod. So if we think of that in connection with Susan's case, she can observe that you know, people are spending most of their time working on their own projects. She can observe that there's not much, well, the results on the individual teams' projects are going well, which is something that she's picked up. She's actually observed, and I didn't mention this earlier, that KPIs on the cross-team projects, they're barely being met. You know, that's all potentially observable. If she sees them talking mainly about their own team projects, well, that, you know, that could be observable as long as she's fairly specific about that. But when she comes to saying the problem is a lack of time spent on cross-team projects, there she's getting into an interpretation. There's a judgment being made there. Now, it's true that we make judgments even selecting what we observe, but it's just being as disciplined as possible and asking ourselves, you know, is what I'm saying here really observable, or am I making an interpretation? If I'm making an interpretation, can I kind of peel back the layers of interpretation, bring myself back to more to observation? So that's all I really wanted to say about that there. Could we you know, maybe take a sounding, Steve and John, and just check out what people's reaction is to this idea of observation?
Sure. Yep. You can put that
Maybe
in
get some chat room
Yeah.
feedback.
Let's see here. Dr. Lin said there's a possible link to funding for a client has a lot of questions, objections about my client project, and yet keeps engaged by one issue than another. I asked him to have a CC with the client. We'll see. And the bot Z says, I see working from observation as described. And Dr. Lin said, Gerardo, do you have any influence on those discussions? Can you facilitate very sensitive issues, culture, financial, etc.? And Gerardo says, almost we have merged 4 states-based 70-plus-year-old not-for-profit into single entity. 5 months in and much to do. Dr. Lin says, yes, I found over 30-plus years in OT that process observation is one of the most powerful approaches in ODOT. This is the skill I look for first when choosing colleagues or consultants to train in my systems. They're not aware of the process. They're not ready for advanced positive strengths-based leadership. And Dr. Lin says, wow, Gerardo, great, big task. I can imagine the layers that have to be worked through. And Gerardo replies, thanks, Lynn, that's great advice. And Bob Z chimes in, previously controls, but now just the slide, that's what he's seeing, now just the slide observation in Susan's case. That's what he's seeing. So those are some of the comments in the chat room, Don.
Yeah, that's good. I think when we're surrounded with complexity, where we're working with difficult clients with multiple issues, or we're trying to merge organizations with 70-year histories, there's so much analysis, so much interpretation. So if we just focus on a few key things that we can observe now and use those, as it were, as a kind of window into the larger issues, it just helps us get a bit of clarity on what's really important to focus on, and it invites inquiry. Here's what I notice. We've been 70 years on different tracks, but we have certain things in common, which are these. Do you notice those? If so, what do you think about them? Or, whatever it might be, but just getting the conversation to that level of specificity. So we might move on to the reasonableness leg, and again think about what that means in Susan's case. So when we're the whole idea of the reasonableness leg is that when we're working with other people, we tend to make judgments about them. I guess from attribution theory and psychology, we make judgments. When things are going well, we take the credit. When things are not going well, we make adverse judgment about others. They're self-interested. They don't want to change. They're stuck in a groove. They lack commitment, whatever it might be. But when we make those sorts of judgments, it's almost impossible to test them, because to do so creates such anxiety and threat for everybody that we avoid those interactions. Yet if we presume that just at this moment that others are capable of being reasonable, then we're putting ourselves in a position where we can formulate interpretations and put them out for testing. So, I notice something. I imagine to you this might mean, let's take the example with this 70-year-old organizations being merged. I noticed that you've got certain things in your culture that you've talked about as valuing. I presume those would be pretty important to you, that you wouldn't want to lose them. So it's sort of thinking, what would a reasonable person or group in this situation, likely to be assuming or to be valuing or to feel or to have knowledge about? So, maybe a 70-year-old organization's got elements of its culture that really matter to them that they want to protect. So just holding out the observation that there's certain things you notice, an interpretation that allows reasonableness, and then just testing that, like, is there anything in this? Or maybe there's something completely different that I've missed. But at least you get the conversation going. So if we go to Susan's case, so she's noticed that the teams are focusing on their own KPIs. Maybe an assumption they're making is that the organisation values the work of individual teams as most important and more important than anything they might do collaboratively. And maybe what really matters to them is to deliver on what they see as their key accountabilities. But maybe also allowing reasonableness. They've got doubts or reservations about the approaches that other teams adopt, seeing they seem to have some differences in their approach to the aged care work. They might have doubts about the ability of other groups to deliver on collaborative ventures, based in sort of past transactions and so on. I think that's still consistent with reasonableness. But if she says, as she did to a colleague, look, these team leaders don't value collaboration, well, I don't know that that one survives the reasonableness test, because we might say that, you know, reasonable people could be presumed to not dismiss collaboration out of hand, you know, to be open to some level of collaboration. So we kind of strike that one out on the basis it doesn't survive the reasonableness test, is probably not testable. So we're trying to get ourselves in a position where we're noticing a few key things, we're formulating interpretations or hypotheses about that, allowing reasonableness, and we're putting ourselves in a position to test them or to inquire into what else might be going on for stakeholders with an interest in this issue who are acting reasonably. So I wonder, Steve and John, could we throw that to the group and seek a response as well?
Yep, I put it out to the group, and so we're waiting for some answers to come in. And then Gerardo's also talking in the chat room about the merger and acquisition process for his nonprofit, and talking about consensus on future state of operations, products and services, and who makes those decisions are some of the big layers that he's working through right now. And Dr. Lynn replied that good results and lots of laughter makes it fun and easier. And then we're waiting to see some reactions to come into about the tripod.
Well, I'd be certainly interested in hearing from anyone who thinks that the reasonableness leg, you know, might not be important, for example, or maybe somebody who's tried out using something like this and can offer some feedback on, you know, what happens when you discipline yourself to presume reasonableness. Of course, it doesn't mean you have to think people are, you know, reasonable all the time. It could be acknowledging very difficult histories. It's not about putting a sort of overly sunny or, you know, sanitized interpretation on what's going on. It's just mindfully allowing that people have a way of making sense of an issue that seems sensible to them. And it's about stepping into their shoes and trying to stretch out our own narrative, our own story, our own account of what's going on, to draw in some of these different perspectives. And when we do that, the prospect is we may open up you know, more ways of understanding the issue, a richer way of appreciating it that we can then work with others to take forward.
Hey, John?
Yep.
There's a question from Henrietta, and I probed her a little bit to see if she could say more about the question. But she wants to know, is this about gathering the information, or is this just about thinking about the possibilities? And what would you say would be a good answer for that question?
Well, it's primarily about thinking about possibilities. It's not, you know, it's both really. I mean, you're talking to people and you're assessing your interpretations of that. So we're really primarily, the work is to open up our thinking, to enrich our understanding. So there is a bit of an information gathering component, but it's primarily a kind of a cognitive process. But what I find is if you actually write down the interpretations that come to you and actually think about what might people be assuming here, what might they be interested in or want to protect, you know, what might they be valuing here, what might they be feeling, and what knowledge or experience might they have. And you do that for each of the stakeholder groups, and just jot down a few notes, and then go through and ask yourself, which ones of these are consistent with reasonableness, and, you know, how could I test them? And from that, you generate some questions. I actually did this only a week or so ago with a large hospital, a group of senior managers and executives and clinicians in a hospital. They're facing an issue of having to, they've got a sort of long-term positive outlook for their budget, but they've got an immediate short-term crunch between now and the end of June. And the question this group was facing, there were about 70 people in the room, was how can we have a dialogue with our colleagues, stakeholders, staff and others about the tension that exists between this short-term crunch and the prospect of longer-term growth and transformation. How can we sort of hold this space? And so small groups broke up, and they were thinking about what was observable, you know, what were they picking up in the narrative, what was being said by the various players, and then what might be interpretations that would attribute reasonableness to the players. And they actually came up with a really rich you know, profile of possible interpretations, which they then went on to generate questions about. Whereas had they not done that, they might have been more prone to going directly into sort of technical analyses and you know, formulation of strategies about communicating key messages and so on. So if we think of divergent and convergent thinking for a group like that, this is the divergent work, opening up the issue, and then they need to converge and think, okay, from this, you know, opening up process, how are we going to take it forward? What strategies are we going to apply? Yeah. So how are we going there, Steve and John? Are there any more chat room contributions?
Yeah, there are. It's actually bubbled up in response to your reaction to Henrietta's question. First, Henrietta said, thanks for the answer. Bob said, generally speaking, it seems to him that discipline oneself to be open to possibilities beyond our assumptions, but one must be aware of their assumptions first, and that requires some deliberate reflection of yourself and of the circumstances. And then, and then Dr. Lynn said that she's not a fan of reasonableness. She does, in positive systems, we seek amazing results instead, going beyond what we thought of as reasonable or possible. She feels that there are much better results and much more fun and exciting being way outside the box. She said her mantra is, box, what box? I never saw a box in the first place.
There's a couple of very interesting points raised. Can I just comment on those two?
Absolutely. Comment on those two, and then let me know when you're ready for another one.
Okay, yeah. So Bob's point about disciplined self-reflection, that's absolutely critical. I think it's one way of framing that is to, as Bob's suggesting, ask ourselves, what assumptions are we making? What's really important to us here? What are we feeling? What knowledge and experience are we bringing to this issue? And if we're going to, I suppose a long-term interest from mine has been relational interaction. You know, so we're not seeing the problem as just residing with others. We're seeing it as a system issue. We're players in the system just as are other people. If we want to inquire into what's going on for other people, we've got to have some insights, as Bob suggests, into what's going on for ourselves. That's vital. Now, going to Dr. Lynn's report about not being a fan of reasonableness, I think we're maybe conflating two things here. This is not a matter of mediocrity or you know, not being fully creative and open to all the possibilities that emerge. The whole tripod structure is very open to positive futures, but we're just avoiding being constrained by a kind of problem future possible binary. We're just staying in the moment and trying to imagine the range of possibilities, but then not be confined by those. We're still going to inquire, what else might there be? What might we have missed? What perspectives have we not taken into account? So I'm as big a fan of the fun of opening up possibilities as Dr. Lynn is, but I think attributing reasonableness to others about what's going on in the present is a way of actually having those difficult conversations that the positive agenda often, in my assessment, steps around. So we could probably have a lengthy offline conversation about that. But I guess I'm wanting to pose a bit of a challenge to the OD community that there's not only a binary between, you know, the deficit problem-oriented approach and the future positive one. There is real merit in staying in the moment and seeing what possibilities that opens up to us. Back to you, Steve.
Yeah, that was great. Thanks, Don. And I think that's helpful. I'll wait and see what some of the reactions that come in the room are. Lisa Butler also said around the concept of reasonableness, she said that this is a foundation of interest-based negotiation. She said you're always trying to understand the underlying interest of a perspective. Yeah,
absolutely true. I agree fully with that. If you go back to the famous negotiation books, Getting to Yes, you know, back in the early 90s, it was all about focusing on the interests of the parties involved getting past positional negotiation and thinking what really matters, and helping the various parties satisfy their needs, doing that creatively, and the synergies resulting can often lead you into quite new spaces. So back to you, Steve.
Yeah. I think we should go to the next one.
Okay, so to the next comment or the next slide, sorry?
Next slide.
Yeah. Okay, so speaking with authenticity. So if we just think about the authenticity leg of the tripod, have we got that one up there? Can people see that slide? Let's hope they can.
Yeah.
Okay, so the proposition here is, if we speak in ways that are really true to us, we're likely to encourage others to be true to themselves in the way they speak to us. We're likely to have more authentic conversations generally. Often we avoid speaking authentically, we skip around the topic, we dance over the difficult aspects, we want to avoid embarrassment or threat. But if we've built a platform based on observable data and attributions of reasonableness, then as long as we're holding those two legs of the tripod up, my radical proposition is we can say pretty much whatever we like. I actually have some ideas on how you can shape, how you can shape what you might say. But it's not about constraining what we might say. It's really just get those first two legs of the tripod, reasonableness and observation, and the third one kind of stands fairly easily. So if we think about this in connection with Susan's case, now I'm moving to the slide headed authenticity, what Susan might say. So we can see there we've gathered the data from the observation and reasonableness legs. So she's observed teams are performing well on their own KPIs, that the cross-team ones are not working so well, that team leaders talk mainly about their own topics, and she's interpreted that to, maybe it's about the team leaders assuming that their own work is more important, and so it goes. So in authenticity, she might register that first observation, well, the first and second ones. Look, I noticed that you're all doing well on your particular KPIs, but we're not doing so well on our joint ones. Just sort of hold that out there, but then check that with people. Do you notice this too? If so, what do you think might explain that we're doing better on the individual projects than the collective ones? So just an open exploration of what their thinking is about that difference. She might then frame an interpretation. So coming from the reasonableness contribution, she's picking up on that middle interpretation there about team leaders wanting to ensure they deliver on their key accountabilities. And so she's just putting that out as a question. I'm wondering if part of the difficulty here is people assuming that the work of individual teams is more highly valued than the cross-team work, and just testing, is there anything in this interpretation? And if they say, well, no, maybe not that much, then is there something else? Open it up, being more exploratory. And another part of the authenticity piece is sharing her interest, going back to Bob's point about being clear what matters to you. Noticing in her own kind of thinking that what really matters to her is the high performance on both the joint projects and the individual ones. And so just being able to register, here's what matters to me. In a way, this is perhaps knowledge that she's not shared with the group before, or maybe she has, but it's just, if this matters to me, I'm going to put it out there, and I'm going to trust that people will hear that. I'm not going to do it in a directive or prescriptive way. I'm just declaring what truly matters to me. So perhaps could we take a comment or two on the authenticity leg?
Yeah, we can take a couple comments. So if anyone has any reactions to what they just heard and were able to read from the slides about authenticity, then go ahead and add them to either chat room, like either on GoToWebinar or in the chat feed.
Hey, Don, I have a quick question for you on this that I was curious about. In terms with authenticity, the observation and the authentic statement, could you help me connect the notion of facts versus judgments between those two and how you connect the observation and facts with the authenticity and the judgments and how a person can bring that reasonableness to it?
Yeah, that's good. So and sorry, I couldn't tell whether that was John or Steve, but
it was Steve. It was Steve.
Yeah, good, Steve. So Steve, the way I'd suggest we do that is by thinking about, well, what are you actually observing, and you might even think about what am I observing in my inner thinking. Like I'm feeling a bit uncomfortable about something somebody just said. So as long as you're not saying something that's negative about another group or stakeholder, just sharing your observations, here's what I'm noticing. So just putting that out there. And then when you're making an interpretation, here's how I'm making sense of what it is I've noticed. So I've noticed A, I'm interpreting it as B, and as long as that attribution is consistent with reasonableness, then you can kind of hold that out there. And you can say, well, I interpret it as B, maybe this is what matters to you. And then you can either ask a question about that, like tell me if that's true, what's really behind that, why does it matter? Or you might want to branch off and say, well, I take it that's important to other people, but something that matters to me is whatever it is. So it's kind of just holding out the observation, making the interpretation and voicing that as long as it's consistent with reasonableness, and then thinking, where do I want to go with this? Do I want to ask a question based on it, or do I want to say something that matters to me? So my suggestion is that, if you're asking a question, if you actually build in and, as it were, almost itemize the observations and interpretation. So here's what I noticed, here's how I make sense of that. I'm wondering if that's the way you see it, or there's something more, or, So building into your narrative your observations and your interpretations, and then taking it where you want to go. I don't know if that answers your question, Steve, but that's how I kind of approach this.
Yeah, that's helpful, because I find it often interesting that people, when you say performing well, for example, that what you might be called performing well, I might call performing great or amazing, or maybe not so well. So a lot of times when we make that observation, the role of facts in that, particularly when we help people understand how the KPIs are connected to me saying well, for example.
So performing well, implies a bit of interpretation, a bit of judgment. You've got some sort of sense of what good performance looks like, and you're making a judgment, wrapping that up and expressing it. So if you say instead, I've noticed that you've consistently met, 6 out of 7 of your KPIs, and almost got across the line with the 7th one, which we agree is sort of less important. To me, that represents, good performance in that, give you reasoning behind that. So it's really about explicating, being as fine-grained as you can with the observable data. So instead of saying performing well, you've done X, Y, and Z against our agreement, which said whatever it was. Here's how I interpret that. Maybe some would say great. I say well because there was some little thing that wasn't done. So just being more transparent about here's what I observe, here's how I make sense of it. This kind of takes us to the being mindful slide, which comes up a little later in the presentation. If we could we just go to that slide? It's got a picture of looking out a train window.
Yeah, I think let's go to that slide in just a second.
Okay.
And only because a couple things have bubbled up in the chat room, and there's a couple questions. So let's do that, and then we go into the mindful slide. Bob said assumptions might be driven by values. Diverse people have diverse values that touch on what matters to them, and so he was talking about, when we were discussing assumptions, that might also be touching into somewhat of the idea of diversity. Said in her experience, the biggest obstacle in companies is telling people to work in teams with little or no training in group dynamics, group leadership, or facilitation. She also said one company just sent everyone a funny film on meetings by a British comic, and she's not making it up. Lisa Butler said in reaction to authenticity, she said it's helpful to model this and sometimes even reframe it. She said, like reasonableness factor, there's a need to start at the point where people are being or wanting to be authentic in their observations. And because it's difficult, there's a need for the facilitator or for someone to hold the space and stay with something until you're able to get to that authentic space.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of things coming through here. Let me just touch on a couple of them. Bob's point about the assumptions driven by values and questions of diversity. Look, I think that's absolutely true. There can be all sorts of things. So it's just getting to, again, going back to, we can make all sorts of interpretations about what's driving people and behind their assumptions. But if we just register what we're actually noticing, and then, we might think a particular cultural group or ethnic group or religious group or whatever, is associated with a certain value. I mean, you have to be very careful about going into those sort of spaces, but you might want to test an interpretation around values that matter there. But again, being very careful about judging, that this is a values question rather than a question of, priorities or something else. So if you think the issue is to do with values, then name it as such and inquire into it, and allow, as the other speaker suggested or the other contributor suggested, that people, they do want to be reasonable, do want to be authentic by and large, and sort of start with that and kind of hold that space as much as you can. But the actual way of holding the space, I find, is just to bring people back to observation. Just ask the question, what are you actually noticing here? Let's just sit with that. And people often struggle with that because they're actually in interpretation. They've rushed off somewhere else. So let's bring it back. Let's just go back to observation. What are we seeing? And it's a way of sort of centering a group, helping them be present, helping them be in the moment, helping you perhaps, if necessary, recapture a bit of a ground in your facilitation. So it's a very powerful strategy. On the little or no training on teamwork and the funny films and so on, yeah, look, I think that's true. Again, many different approaches to team development, but if you can actually, with a team, just practice some of these simple disciplines, I think you'll, despite allowing that you need to do all sorts of other things, you might find that these practices are helpful. And certainly on the point about authenticity and the need to model that and reframe, yeah, if you're not modeling authenticity, then if you're saying one thing and it's like, I remember a formal leader in an organisation once saying to me, look, Don, you've got to tell people where you think they need to go and then help them think it's their idea. Well, such devices tend to be seen through, and often people will make a judgment that you've got an agenda, that you're playing a game, and that's likely to encourage similar responses on their part. So the modelling piece is really vital. So back to you, Steve.
This is John, and
John, sorry.
No, it's okay. And thanks for going through those reactions. It's definitely adding richness to the conversation. So I'm going to ask this question from Gerardo, and then I'm going to go over to the mindfulness slide because I think they go hand in hand. Don wants to know what about when someone deliberately works against you or works their own agenda or outcomes? How can you be reasonable with that type of person?
Okay, that's a very interesting one. So it's not about so much you being reasonable, it's about you attributing to the other person that at this moment they're acting in ways that make sense to them and imagining what those are. So when you say someone deliberately works against you, well, that's a judgment, and it probably violates the reasonableness principle, because reasonable people don't usually deliberately work against other people. I guess the proposition is that that person or group have got a need that they see as legitimate, and they're working to pursue that interest or that need. And so the question is to observe the behaviour. I noticed that whatever it was they did. You made a dismissive comment about our group in a meeting. I'm wondering, I noticed that. I'm wondering what's behind it. Does that reflect some frustration with something we've done that you think is against your interest? So this is where the point about your own assumptions, your own analysis, and being aware of that when you're going to judgment is so critically important. As soon as you say someone's deliberately working against you, well, it's very hard to have the conversation on that level. You'll end up strategizing, maybe to outpoint them or to go over their head, which the other party is likely to see as just your effort to undercut them. So let's step back, go back to the observable data and see if we can open up the space a bit. So, John, are we good to go back to that slide?
I went to the mindful slide. Did you want me to go back to?
Yeah, no, the mindful slide's good. So the one with the picture there of the train carriage. Let me just say something very brief about mindfulness, and this thinking is based on the work of Ellen Langer, and she's been researching in this field for decades, and has been an influence on me for a very long time. And one of her key messages is about just noticing difference, noticing new things, not getting caught up in large categories. So I'm reminded of a story of a couple of people in a train carriage. They're crossing a large area which is referred to as a desert, and one of them looks out the window and says, "Oh well, look, it's all just desert to me. I'll be glad when we get across this. It's all the same." And yet the other person is noticing subtle differences. As the miles pass, they're noticing different types of plant, different colours in the topography, little bits of difference in the rise and fall of the land, whatever it might be. But they're appreciating that subtlety. They're taking a more fine-grained look. They're not looking at every grain of sand in the desert, but they're appreciating the richness and the diversity just through mindfully observing. And this notice of noticing, thinking about, what's off to the side, what are the subtle signals we might not pick up, what are the big categories we're applying. These people are resistors. This is a desert. Let's actually get down to the more specifics here and just try and notice without judgment. The second point, let's loosen our attachment to our analyses and hold that other views might be possible. And we might be inclined to say, but I've seen this with my own eyes. I know it to be true. Well, our eyes can deceive us. We can objectify what we see and believe that others must be, uninformed or biased or not seeing the true picture. We need to allow that we're capable potentially of the same sort of lapses in perception as other people. So just allowing that, well, hey, there are different ways of making sense of this, and if we acknowledge that, then there are some implications. So, for example, with our language, instead of saying, this is what's happening here, you can say, well, here's what I'm seeing and here's how I make sense of it, or one possible interpretation of this is, or, we could think of it this way or that way. We're just loosening up our attachment to ways of seeing. The third point there, just the imagining. Imagination doesn't get a lot of work in the, or a lot of exposure in the management, leadership, OD kinds of literatures, but to me it's critically important. It is it's a creative process of imagining individually and collectively what might be going on for the community of people interested in this issue, what possibilities might there be for action beyond where we are now. I just wanted to register that the importance of imagination here. We're getting beyond usual prescriptions of firm and logical, rigorous analysis to kind of, and they certainly have their place, but we're opening up beyond them. So that's really all I wanted to say about that slide. So I think we've only got a few minutes left. I'll be interested in hearing some more reactions there, Steve and John.
Yeah, I'll bring in a couple reactions, and then I'll turn it over to Steve to kind of do a little bit of a wrap-up, and then Don will bring it, and I'm sure Steve will bring it back over to you to see if there was anything else for reactions. But Don, there's a couple of things that bubbled up. Lynn said that authenticity is crucial. The match between say and do, one of the key things they work on with client executives. Gerardo said that even after, and he said, Don, even after everyone else has agreed to the goal or outcome, where they're the only one going off. Bob says we do encounter unreasonable people. He has encountered folks who do prove themselves unscrupulous. And Gerardo and Dr. Lynn both agreed with Bob. And so on that, encountering folks who prove themselves unscrupulous.
Yeah, look, it's true that, look, some people, you know, no matter what you do, they seem to be unreasonable. This is not to say that's not true, but it's saying if we start off from that presumption, we'll only see, you know, negative motives and intentions, and we won't be able to have that challenging conversation productively. So it's trying to allow that even the most seemingly generally unreasonable person might, in this instance, this very specific instance just now, be capable of something different. So it's allowing the possibility and working with that. Now, if they then act in ways that you think are objectively unreasonable, or if they're doing things that you think are unscrupulous, you know, they're acting in ways that are ethically, you know, compromised, well, this is not about, you know, then you have to act decisively. No one's sort of saying you don't. So we've got to allow that we're firm and tough, make the decisions, call the shots, do all that sort of stuff. But this is just about when we want to have that conversation. It goes to the question of intention, and it's really about whether we want to manage a situation, bring it to a result, and perhaps this is where Gerardo is coming from, I'm not sure, get a resolution, make something happen, then, you know, we need to converge, and we might want to sort of minimize the amount of playing around we do with the reasonable space and observation and so forth. But if we want to have a conversation that's more developmental, if we want to think, how could we grow something new here? How could we create something different? What's a way of moving from this space that might be outside the box of our usual thinking? Then I suggest you'll find practicing these disciplines will be, you know, especially helpful. So the intention thing links back to authenticity. It's you know, what really matters to me? What do I want to do here? And being able to say that and then act accordingly. So I'll pause there.
Yeah, very good.
I'm sorry. Go ahead, John.
Oh no, yeah, you go ahead, Steve, and then there are just some other comments that need to be brought in.
Yeah, Don, this may have no relevance, but for some weird reason, this image keeps popping up in my head. It's you're walking out of a restaurant with your family, and there's a person standing there as you get to your car, and they have a gun, and they're going to rob you. That image just comes into my mind as like the most extreme, unreasonable, or, you know, situation, you know, or a person who's way on the other end. Yet I have heard stories of people who have handled that in some amazing ways and been in those situations.
Yeah. I can relate to that, Steve. It's actually happened to me. I was bailed up by a group of young kids who wanted to attack me in a lane in another city, and I talked my way out of it, basically, not strictly using these principles, but using this kind of method. And I ended up walking out of there without being beaten up, so it got a good outcome as far as I was concerned. But I'm not suggesting you should always try and talk your way, you know, out with the person of the gun. You know, you've got to kind of make a call about what's required in that moment. Diving under the next car might be a better solution. I don't know.
But I do think there's a point to be made that in probably even the most unexpected situation, being mindful might save your life.
It could do, absolutely. That's certainly true, and that's a good point to come in on. I just wonder if just one last question if I could put to the group, whether any of them have actually looked at the videos, and if so, is there any feedback on those? So these were the videos to which people were given a link, I think, prior to the session.
Yeah, I posed that on the chat, so we'll see if if there are some reactions that come in. But we do have some other reactions, and kind of closing it out for tonight. Lisa said that unreasonable is often around change management. She said people have learned to hold their breath or have a tantrum, and have found that it works. And so in the case, in those cases, the behavior is reasonable to them. She said there's a danger in working. Dr. Lynn said that she's turned around many clients who seemed unreasonable at first by not judging them, but they truly want success for their organization. But whereas the unscrupulous are different, they have agendas that is all for themselves. Bob says, I think we touch on the idea of ethical behavior, figuring out how to deal with unethical behavior. Bob also said the ideas of mindfulness have been around for some time. However, the practical application seems to be a challenge for all of us. So I'd be interested to see if, Bob, you were able to from what Don said about mindfulness. Let's see. Kim said that she runs into that a lot in her field, and I think it means people with their own agendas. She has quite a few passive-aggressive coworkers, and they do not have an option to work or not work with them. She's gotten creative to accomplish her goals. Gerardo said the videos were great, and so has the session been great, very worthwhile. Contribution to support his current and future challenges. Dr. Lynn said when dealing with someone not pro-team, she works with their boss for a solution and cannot be done as an outside consultant.
Well, there's lots of really interesting feedback there. Look, I wonder if I could just throw out another thought. I would certainly encourage people to have a go at applying the tripod in whatever issues they're dealing with, and maybe if they could send you some feedback, or send it to me, via my website dondemoon.com. I'd really be interested in hearing people's experience in trying this out.
Yeah, and we would be interested in definitely facilitating that conversation too. So I will send out that question as part of the follow-up to this email, and it'll go out the slides and the recording. So I think we definitely do that, and I'll make sure to put an email address in there so if they practice the tripod, they can send us back their reactions, and we might even have another webinar where we invite everyone who was on tonight to be brought in as panelists and share your work with the tripod, and then having another session. So I can definitely help coordinate that, and we'll be glad to do that.
Well, that's great. Thanks, John.
I think that's great, and I think we can use a discussion forum on LinkedIn, and for people that couldn't be here, the recording will be a part of the question, and we can ask people to, hey, take a look at this, and what do you think about, and here are a couple questions, and so maybe we can help facilitate it that way. And I think another webinar may be focused on people who have viewed it, so setting it up so that people get the recordings and watch them as a part of the discussion and focus solely on that would be great next.
That sounds fantastic to me. Look, I'm really pleased to have had this opportunity. I'm very grateful to OD practitioner and John Vogelsang, and to you, Steve and John, for setting this up. It's been a great experience, and to all the participants and all the rich comments and inputs. It's been wonderfully stimulating for me, so thank you.
You're welcome. And so as we check out, I'm curious for all of you out there in chat land, if you could give us a bumper sticker Gestalt checkout, meaning just a word or a phrase that captures your takeaway from today, maybe a one point or something that's important that you'll use or whatever it might be. So a quick bumper sticker phrase captures you as you leave. And for John Vogelsang, anything you want to say as we say goodbye, and what's your takeaway for today?
I'm very grateful for what you shared tonight, Don. It's again one of those methods that calls us back to being grounded and mindful in a way that is very productive, and we often forget about that and think of all kinds of fancy ways of dealing with the situation when basically we need to return to what are core practices. Thank you, Don.
Thank you, John.
And Steve, we have 2 more of these coming up. When's Judith Katz and Fred Miller?
That's at the end of this month. Is that right, John Spalding?
The date was postponed. We're still trying to get a firm date from.
Okay.
So keep a lookout on our announcements for the next ones that are coming up. And again, we've got, let's see, we've got LinkedIn. We'll have a discussion there. You'll get a survey at the end of this, and I ask you to fill it out, please. That will be very helpful to us. And other than that, Don, I thank you very much for your time. I appreciate the simplicity of your approach, and I love the discussion on these chat rooms. Thank you, all of you out there, having a great conversation. That also adds a lot to my knowledge base as well. So with that, I think we're done. And everybody have a great day, and bye for now.
Thank you, and goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Don. Bye.
Cheers.
And Steve.